So after 20 years of research and 4 years of writing, I'm so excited to launch my first book, The Hype Machine, about how social media is disrupting our democracies, our economies, and our public health. But really from rigorous scientific first principles and in a fast-paced cloak and dagger story full of geopolitical intrigue. It talks about how social media really works under the hood. What happens to your brain when you're using social media, the neuroscience of it all, the economics of the technology, and how that can explain how Facebook really beat MySpace. How and why fake news travels farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information, and what that means for our democracies and for genocidal propaganda worldwide. All the way to how social media algorithms are impacting dating, and therefore relationships, and therefore human evolution. Along the way, I provide guidance for how we can fix social media and what we need to do next. We're at a crossroads. What we do next is going to determine the world we create. I really hope this book can help us steer towards the promise of social media and away from the peril.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Andy McAfee, and I am the co-founder and the co-director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. And it seems to me that we could all use some good news these days. So I have some good news to share today. And it's good news if you are a friend or a colleague or an admirer, or like me, all three of Sinan Aral. It's a good news if you are a fan of the kind of rigorous and relevant research that MIT specializes in. It's good news if you are a fan of people who can take rigorous and relevant scientific research and turn it into a page-turner book. And it's good news if you are somebody who is kind of interested in this broad, very new, clearly very, very important phenomenon of worldwide social media and the effects that it's having on, fill in the blank, our brains, our democracies, our politics, business competition. I have trouble thinking of a bigger topic these days, and I have real trouble thinking of anybody better to write the book than Sinan. So the fundamental good news is that today is the launch date of The Hype Machine, Sinan's book, and he is with us today to talk about it and to take some questions. So I'm going to kick it over to Sinan in a minute. He's going to give us a lightning fast overview of the book, and then he and I are going to have a chance to talk. I would love it if you would post your questions on the interface that you see in front of you, the things that come up that are either on your mind right now or that come up during Sinan's remarks, the things that you would like to ask him. I will channel that, and we're going to spend the last chunk of our time together in conversation with Sinan. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague and friend, Sinan Aral. Over to you, sir.
Hey everyone, so thanks Andy, and thank you all for coming. It's such a huge pleasure and an honor to be able to talk about this book with this community, the IDE community. For those of you who don't know me, I am the director of the Initiative on the Digital Economy. I am a graduate of MIT Sloan and got my PhD at MIT. And I have been researching the role of social media in our economy and in our democracy and in our lives for 20 years since I started my PhD, before even Facebook was founded, and have been writing this book for 4 years. So it's truly exciting to say that it actually launches tomorrow in just a few hours after 4 years of writing. So what I'd like to do is to walk you through a little bit, just a quick teaser summary of the book with some slides, and then really make this a conversation about these critical issues. And I see this book as being a really important moment in time, because so much of our society, be it the democratic questions or the public health questions around the pandemic, hinges on how our reality is framed, what kind of information we consume, and how this technology is changing our behavior. And I really think that this is a conversation that we need to be having as a society, and I want to play my part in that conversation. So let me share my slides and take you on a whirlwind tour of this book, and then turn it back into what I much prefer, which is a conversation. So bear with me. So think back to the 2016 election, okay? When you think about the 2016 election, the story of that election with regard to social media was the interference and social media manipulation that Russia propagated on social media in 2016 in the months leading up to the election. And if you'll recall, we've done research now, and even the Senate Intelligence Committee, which commissioned the research on the subject, found that Russia spread misinformation and social media manipulation to 126 million people on Facebook in 2016, 20 million people on Instagram, 10 million tweets to people, to 6 million followers of accounts on Twitter, 43 hours of YouTube content, 43 hours of YouTube content of manipulative efforts in the 2016 election. All of this is detailed in the book, as is the role of this type of misinformation in the 2020 election. And what's different in this election is that we know that Russia is intervening as we speak in our election. It's happening during a global pandemic and amidst civil unrest that began with the justifiable social movement around police brutality, but is now obviously much more contentious in the streets of our cities in the United States. We know that although Russia is the dominant player in this space, that China and Iran have joined into the effort, that Russia, in order to get around platform rules against inauthentic accounts, they are nudging real US citizens to spread misinformation rather than impersonating or creating fake accounts. They have moved many of their servers to US soil to avoid domestic surveillance, which is curtailed by law in terms of our surveillance, surveilling domestically, as well as they've infiltrated Iran's cyber war department, perhaps to launch attacks that seem to come from Iran rather than from Russia. And this is going on at scale as we speak. But it's not just about our elections, it's also about our economies. So the second chapter of the book is called The End of Reality, which is all about the spread of falsity, which MIT and the IDE have been a leader in the research of now for many years. And in 2013, in April 2013, the AP, Associated Press Twitter handle, put out this tweet, which said, "Breaking, 2 explosions in the White House and Barack Obama has been injured." And this tweet went viral. It was retweeted 4,000 times in 5 minutes, but it wasn't true news or real news. It was fake news by Syrian hackers that had infiltrated the AP Twitter handle. And the problem with the hype machine, the social media industrial complex, is that it's coupled to other systems that magnify its impact. So in this case, it's coupled to automated trading algorithms that trade on the sentiment that's expressed on Twitter. And when a tweet that goes viral about the first possible successful attack inside the White House having injured the President of the United States, the sentiment is not good. And in this case, the automated trading algorithms trading on this sentiment sent the stock market crashing, and it wiped out nearly $140 billion in equity value in a matter of minutes, and that's a single tweet. Think about the fact that we have trillions of tweets a day that are moving opinions, behaviors, and perceptions around the world, affecting not only elections and democracy, but also the markets. It's not just about economics and markets. It's not just about elections and democracy. It also has a lot to do with our health. So there's a tremendous amount of misinformation about the pandemic that has been spreading since its beginnings. And that has dramatic consequences for things like vaccine confidence, whether people will take vaccines or not, and what that will do to slow down or stop the spread of the coronavirus. But before the coronavirus, we had seen the consequences of health misinformation at scale in just the year before, in the measles outbreaks of 2019. You may be surprised to know that measles was eradicated in the United States in the year 2000. In 2010, there were only 63 cases of measles in the United States. But in just the first 6 months of 2019, there were 1,250 cases concentrated in pockets like Rockland County, New York, or Clark County, Washington. And if you look at the data, as I do in this book, about where anti-vaccine advertisements and content were concentrated, they were targeted at communities like Clark County, Washington, and Rockland County, New York, creating vaccine hesitancy, lowering the rates of vaccinations, reducing the herd immunity, and creating, in part, the rise of measles outbreaks from a deadly disease that is incredibly contagious and had been eradicated 10 years before. So this has tremendous consequences for our society. And what is this? This is what I call the hype machine, the social media industrial complex, the combination of technologies like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, WhatsApp, WeChat, Snapchat, etc. And this has tremendous impacts on our society, some of the peril that I've just described, but also a tremendous amount of promise. It has the ability to deliver life-saving value, information, economic opportunity, and so on. Let me give you some examples. So when Nepal experienced the largest earthquake that it experienced in 100 years, Europe and the United States went into immediate action and Europe donated $3 million in relief aid. The United States donated $10 million in relief aid. And Facebook spun up a small Donate Now button and raised $15.5 million, more than the Europe and the US combined, from 770,000 individual donations from 175 countries around the world. The ability to create collective action like this is unprecedented and can do a lot of good in the world. So for instance, it's at the core of modern social movements, from the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States to the Snow Revolution in Russia, the Arab Spring, protests and social movements in Hong Kong and Ukraine. But the problem with social media-driven social movements is they rise rapidly, but they're fragile because they rise so fast that there's not an ability to create an organization, meaningful, prioritize demands, and a sustaining social movement. And so what is the role of technology-driven social mobilization and collective action, and how can we harness it for good to create meaningful social change for things that we really care about, but also become aware of its fragility and its ability to be co-opted by governments, say in Russia, or in authoritarian regimes that also have tremendous power over these platforms. Now, another great example of the very significant but lightweight positive impact that this can have, think about the Ice Bucket Challenge, which raised $250 million in 8 weeks for ALS research. That kind of collective action is incredibly mobilizing. And if you think about it, collective action is something that philosophers and political scientists have been discussing for centuries. Collective action is a problem when an individual's behavior is kind of meaningless by itself, but it's required for meaningful change in society. Voting is a perfect example. Democracy depends on everyone or a lot of people voting, but each individual person's vote is meaningless by itself. In order to combat climate change, we have to have the collective action of millions of people around the world, as well as businesses and others. But each individual's recycling efforts or solar panel by itself is very small. It doesn't move the needle. So creating collective action, which the Hype Machine does by signaling commitment and coordinating action together, can make meaningful changes on meaningful problems in the world. How can we design it in a way to harness that promise? It also creates a tremendous amount of economic opportunity, right? Because small and medium-sized businesses depend on websites like Facebook to operate. In countries like the Philippines and in much of Africa, Facebook is the internet. It is the entire way that small and medium-sized businesses or entrepreneurs reach their communities, reach their customers, get their products and services out. it's been estimated here in studies at the IDE as well as at Stanford that Facebook creates about $170 billion in consumer surplus a year alone in the US. Think about its economic impact around the world. The potential for positive things coming from this technology is very, very large. However, there's also, before the pandemic hit, social media was a pariah. Sacha Baron Cohen was calling it the greatest propaganda machine in history at his keynote at the Anti-Defamation League. We had the Netflix documentary, The Great Hack. Now we have obviously the social dilemma. There was the Delete Facebook movement and the Stop Hate for Profit movement and the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But when the pandemic hit, we were all forced out of the streets and online, and social media use broke records. Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg was quoted as saying, "We're just trying to keep the lights on over here," because so much demand surged for social media, because that's where everybody got their connections to friends and family and their information. It also drove a lot of digital Luddites online who will remain online after the pandemic. And so social media has been ingrained even more into the fabric of society because of the lockdowns created by the COVID pandemic. Now, today, we're at a crossroads between the promise that I described that could be great and the peril that I described and that we've all seen that could be horrible. We're at a crossroads between privacy on one hand and insecurity on the other, between free speech and hate speech, between truth and falsity, democracy and inclusive democracy and authoritarianism, and obviously between meaningful connection and political polarization and affective political polarization ripping us apart, the science of which I describe in detail in the book. And this is really a consequence of the rise of the technology trifecta: digital social networks, smartphones, and machine intelligence rising rapidly over the last 10 years, combining to create what we now know as the hype machine of social media. And this technology was built for our brains. The third chapter in the book is called Your Brain on Social Media. It details the neuroscience behind what happens to your brain as you use social media. And in there, you'll find the story of the evolution of the human brain, which is really about the evolution of our social complexity. So human beings are the most complex social species on the planet. And our brains, which are larger relative to our body weight than most of the other species in the world, and our neocortex ratio compared to the rest of our brain is also much larger. And the reason, one of the primary hypotheses for why this is true is called the social brain hypothesis, that basically we evolved to process social signals, what other people think, how they're thinking, what they think about us, what they might do, and so on. Then imagine creating a technology in the span of just 10 years, which massively scales the social signals that are delivered to our brains in the form of likes and comments and shares. It's like tossing a lit match into a pool of gasoline. It's no surprise why social media rose so quickly, since our brains have evolved to process those social signals. It also makes it hard to imagine a world without the hype machine. I also tell the story, for instance, of Sean Parker telling in an interview in 2017 to Mike Allen saying, well, that's exactly how we designed social media, to give you a little dopamine hit when you get a like or a comment on your content, to keep you coming back for more. So the whole science of the neuroscience of social media is covered in depth, and it describes how this neuroscience is a precursor for the behavior change that the hype machine creates. It also goes into depth in the next chapter about the economics of social media and how a little known paper published in 1974 actually foreshadowed in section 5 of that paper Facebook's go-to-market strategy, and why that go-to-market strategy, which utilized a lesser known type of network effects called local network effects, enabled it to beat MySpace, and why it is so dominant today. Those two things, the neuroscience and the economics, coupled with this notion of walled gardens. The fact that we can't take our pictures from Instagram with us if we leave makes it very hard to imagine a world without the hype machine, and also sets the stage for what we have to do in order to adapt to it. Now, the main thing that drives social media's impact on society, and in particular the hype machine's driving of behavior, is what I call the hype loop, which is described in detail in the book about the dynamic interplay between machine intelligence and human behavior. The machine analyzing our behavior to nudge us and give us recommendations for who to friend next and what to read next and what to buy next. And then our consumption of those suggestions and our decisions to act on some and discard others, that dynamic interplay is what guides our perceptions, beliefs, norms, and behaviors in society today. And that is what is having such a dramatic impact on our democracies, our elections, our economies, and our public health. And the specific algorithms of this hype loop, including people you may know algorithms, which guide the structure of the human social network online, and feed algorithms, which guide the content that we see online, are described in detail and how they affect us. Now, the hype machine framework is this technology trifecta in the middle: digital social networks, smartphones, and machine intelligence, which create the technology that we see, causing three trends, each of which gets their own chapter in the book. The personalization of mass persuasion, the scaling of micro-targeting and how that affects behavior change; hyper-socialization, which essentially injects the opinions of our friends and the crowd into every decision that we make, and what does that do to trends in society; as well as the tyranny of trends, which is about algorithmic amplification and how that creates lightning fast movements of false news, but other types of information online. In these chapters, you'll also see not instruction, but essentially a description of what happens to a world where we had just a decade ago, Surowiecki's book, The Wisdom of Crowds, we had thought that this type of connective technology was going to create a wisdom of crowds. It turns out that that theory rests on independence, but that the hype machine creates hyper interdependence. It turns out that that theory depends on our ability to have an equal say, not a given person being particularly influential, but the hype machine created influencers. And so essentially the hype machine derails the wisdom of crowds, and I describe how we might essentially get it back. Now, the main point I want to make on this slide is that the book describes the four levers that we have at our disposal to affect change and to drive the hype machine into calmer waters and away from the peril that we see happening today. And that is money, code, norms, and laws. The money being the business models and the incentives that are created by those business models of the social media platforms. The code being the design of the algorithms, like people you may know algorithms or feed algorithms, and how that affects the behaviors and outcomes that we see in society. The norms around how we appropriate and use this technology, which can be seen in the Stop Hate for Profit movement and our standing up for the values that we want to see espoused in social media. We can't abdicate our own responsibility in how the hype machine affects our society. And obviously, finally, the laws, how we regulate the market failures created by the hype machine. One of the major questions, obviously, is what do we do? How do we adapt? And the longest chapter in the book is the last chapter. It's about what do we do? And I wanted this book to really transcend the decade of techno-utopianism that existed 2 decades ago, which was followed by a decade essentially of techno-dystopianism, books about how AI was going to destroy the world and also how Facebook and others are destroying the world. I don't want this book to be in either camp. I want this book to transcend both of those camps and to really look under the hood from scientific first principles about how the technology works, and then to think about how we can roll our sleeves up to fix the social media morass that we find ourselves in. As we all know, the MIT motto, Mensa Manus, is hand in mind, learning by doing and doing by learning. I intend this book to be about what can we do by rolling our sleeves up and getting into the nitty-gritty conversations about money, code, norms, and laws. So a big question today is how should we regulate this economy? Another really important piece of that is, for instance, should we break up Facebook? That's the first question I tackle in the last chapter of the book. You might be surprised by the answers that you see in the book. So as I describe in the book, breaking up big tech in the case of Facebook is not going to directly solve our privacy problem or our fake news problem or our election integrity problem. It's geared to try to increase competition. But in markets with network effects, breaking up what are thought to be monopolists in order to create competition without structural reform is like putting a Band-Aid on a tumor, because the next Facebook will tip into monopoly status because the economics of the market tip monopolists into monopoly status if you don't have structural reform. What do I mean by structural reform? I mean interoperability, data portability, social network portability, identity portability, interoperability. And there is pending legislation in front of Congress, like the Access Act, that addresses that type of competition. Privacy, obviously, a huge question. We have 3 different privacy regimes in the world. We have China, which is essentially a surveillance state, the GDPR in Europe, which is very pro-privacy, and in the US, we have a hodgepodge of 50 states establishing their own privacy legislation, with California leading with the CCPA. But I think we're seeing an evolution towards a federal privacy legislation in the United States. What should that look like to harmonize privacy laws? What are the costs and benefits of that kind of legislation in terms of how can we, if privacy is paramount, which I think that we definitely need to protect privacy and need federal privacy legislation, but how can we do that while at the same time retaining the data necessary to audit and protect our elections, or to conduct genomic testing or sharing of scientific data across borders and so on. We've written a lot about protecting our elections from social media manipulation. This is a paper that Dean Eccles and I wrote for Science about how we protect the upcoming election. I have a lot of thoughts about that in the paper. And really, the mission of the book is very simple, which is that I want this to be about what do we do now? How do we roll up our sleeves and actually create positive change? We can achieve the promise of social media and avoid the peril. And this book is an attempt to describe how we must do that and how we must adapt. So in the interest of time, I'm going to just shut up and bring this back to a conversation, which I think is always more productive. So thanks for bearing with me. And I look forward to the conversation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and bring Andy back. Thanks.
Sinan, thanks very much. That's fantastic stuff. And judging by the questions that I see in our chat window, it has provoked a lot of thinking. I'm going to exercise discussant prerogative and ask a question that's been on my mind that I don't think I've ever asked you, even given all the conversations we've had about your work and about this book. You make the case very eloquently that we need to fix social media. There are these real challenges associated with it. You also make the case, and I love how even-handed the book is, you also make the case that these social media platforms have provided tremendous economic benefit and a great deal of personal benefit to literally billions of people around the world. So here's my question. If we couldn't put in any of the fixes that you recommend, would social media still be a net positive or a net negative for the world so far?
I think it completely depends on the decisions that are made by the platforms and the people going forward. Let's say that when you say don't implement any of the fixes, do you mean that people continue to use social media in salacious ways, spread misinformation, the platforms continue to maximize short-term profit to the detriment of societal values and actually long-term shareholder value for those companies? And Russia continues to interfere, and other countries, authoritarian governments continue to use it for, to suppress minority opinions and so on. If that's what you mean by your question, then I think that the answer to that question is that social media has the potential to deliver death blows to our democracies, our economies, and our public health, and we must act. I don't think there's any question that social media, if left unchecked, with no one making moralistic decision, whether it's self-regulation on the part of the platforms or government regulation on the part of the policymakers, or the people using social media, making smarter decisions about what to share, being critical thinkers about misinformation, being reflective about what they share and believe. If none of that happens, then I think we're going to see a rise in political polarization. We're going to see a rise in the live streaming of mass murders. We're going to see a rise in genocidal propaganda. We're going to see a rise in disenfranchisement. We're going to see a dramatic reduction in our confidence in elections and democracy. We're going to see pandemics that are harder to stop. We're going to see all sorts of problems that are related to the fact that this media, which essentially controls a large fraction of what we see and therefore what we believe and therefore how we act, will have negative consequences on society.
Yep. All right, I'm going to go to the questions that we're seeing come in from the participants here because they're fantastic. I particularly love this one. Okay, Sinan, you've just been invited to join the board of either Facebook or Twitter. You can only choose one. Which one would you choose? And what would be your first significant strategy suggestion? And the question goes in, the question lets you off the hook about choosing one. What would be your first significant strategy suggestion for both? So I want to do both parts of this question. Which one would you choose? And then for both, what would your first suggestion be as a board member?
I would choose Facebook for two reasons. One, because I think that it is by far the larger platform and therefore has a much larger footprint on people's opinions and behaviors. And so just in the interests of any advice that I give being consequential on the world, that I would choose Facebook for that reason. And the first thing that I would suggest, because I have been on boards of companies, and getting the ears of the rest of the board members and as well the CEOs is the first step to being an effective board member. I would suggest that that we have conversations with the employees, private conversations, roundtables with the employees of the company. And the reason I would suggest that is because there is a growing rift between the leadership of Facebook and the dedicated technologists that work for Facebook. We are seeing walkouts, we're seeing people write op-eds, we're seeing protests from inside Facebook. And I think that it's one thing for Facebook leadership to face criticism from the media or from policymakers or from politicians in a public forum where they are essentially forced to be defensive and portray a public-facing view of that kind of thing. I'm sure they're having these internal conversations, but I would encourage more of them. I think that Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, need to face the employees of Facebook and have the real heart-to-heart discussion that some of these employers are being forced to have in public by leaving Facebook or writing op-eds and so on, and really come to a soul-searching moment about what we stand for as a platform and as a company. That would be my first sort of ice-breaking suggestion, because I think there's a bit of soul-searching that needs to happen before any specific policy is implemented at Facebook or at Twitter.
Yep, got it. Like you can imagine, there are a number of what can we do questions here. So let me hit some of the best ones here. Here's one that's on everybody's mind. Given that we are 50 days away from Election Day, what can we do to ensure that every vote counts and that the information we're receiving is accurate?
Yeah. So obviously there's a ton of recommendations in the book that aren't about what can you as a citizen do in the next 50 days to help do your part to ensure a fair election. Obviously, I believe in things like election auditing, the idea of paper ballots, the idea of the secure, the Voting Cybersecurity Act, the Secure Democracy Act, those types of legislative efforts to really protect our elections are incredibly important. But I think what the question is asking is, what can I do now that we're only 50 days away? And the fact that the idea that those pieces of legislation are going to pass and are going to be meaningfully funded, et cetera, is unlikely. So I think there are a number of things. I actually wrote about this in the Boston Globe a couple of days ago in an op-ed. There are a number of things that we can do as citizens to make a dramatic difference. So number one, I see this all the time when I see fake news going across the transom on my social media. It's usually preceded by a preamble that says, I don't know if this is true, but it's really interesting if it is. You need to stop doing that. We all need to stop doing that. And the reason we need to stop doing that is because that is exactly how fake news is designed. It's designed to be interesting if it's true, but it's not. So if you feel the need to say that, then my second suggestion is apply the 80-20 rule. What do I mean? A lot, not all, but a lot of the falsity that's going around, some of it has been around for years and is still resurfacing today, can be debunked by a few clicks or Google searches just to say, is this true or is it not? Let me check before I am sharing it or believing it. Third, our research by David Rand, who is a big part of our initiative on the digital economy. He's been doing just like a phenomenal amount of fantastic research on misinformation recently, along with Dean Eccles and many others in the IDE. About misinformation has shown that being reflective goes a long way to reducing people's belief and sharing of false news, which means just take a beat, catch your breath and just think critically for a moment about the information you just read or consumed before moving on to either share or believe it. That reflectivity, being reflective, can go a long way to rooting out as kind of a low-hanging fruit the misinformation. Another thing is to check your emotions, okay? Because false news, we've shown, so we did at the time, the largest ever longitudinal study of the spread of false news online, which was published on the cover of Science magazine in March 2018. We studied 10 years of data on Twitter, and what we found was that false news spread farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information that we studied, and particularly in politics. And what we found, the reason for that is because it's blood boiling, okay? It is salacious, it's surprising, it creates feelings of anger and disgust. So if what you're reading is making you really angry and disgusted and it's shocking and salacious, that should be a sign that says to you, wait a minute, is this real?
Whereas for most of us, it's exactly the opposite. It's, oh my God, I have to share this.
Right, that's exactly why they design it that way. And so if you feel that or you're just about to click and you're like, I'm clicking because I'm so mad.
I'm so mad.
That's exactly when you need to stop and take a beat. And the other thing is that a lot of these, check the source, check the original source, not the person who shared it with you, but the original source. A lot of fake news comes from known lists of fake news websites that have these seemingly legitimate names, but it's kind of like www.americandemocracy.co.biz or, and so you can kind of tell from the website URL that it's shady. As well, it'll have typos or words in all caps and so on. So those are some of like the what can I do today recommendations that I made in the Boston Globe just a couple of days ago.
There's a really nice related question here, which is who's getting it right? Is there any group, any country, any demographic group that appears to be handling the hype machine better than others?
Well, I think that there are pockets of good decisions that are being made by the platforms. I feel so. For good examples would be there is increased automated fact checking on, for instance, Facebook and Twitter. There's more labeling going on, mostly on Twitter, less so on Facebook, but some on Facebook, where the provenance of the information is being revealed to people who are consuming the information. So just a point about labeling, which I think is really important, just to sit on that for a minute, is that think about the food that you buy at the grocery store to consume. It's extensively labeled, right? You know how many calories it has, how many trans fats, if it's produced in a facility that produces wheat and peanuts, if you have an allergy to those things. But the information we consume isn't labeled at all. We don't know the provenance. We don't know really the veracity, the historical veracity of this source. We don't know how many people were interviewed to run with this fact. We don't know the editorial policies of that journal. None of that labeling exists, and yet we consume it without having any of that information about the information that we're consuming. Labeling and fact-checking, debunking has been shown in research to work, but it comes with some caveats. So a good example is David Rand, again, has done some work on what's known as the implied truth effect, which is that if you signal to your users that you're labeling false news, then they assume that things that aren't labeled must be true. And if you can't get to everything, that creates an implied truth effect for labeling. And so, there are different caveats that go along with each of these solutions. We're still weighing all those caveats. We're still doing a lot of the research as well. So getting back to the point, labeling being done at Twitter is a good thing. The fact that we are starting to have hearings where the questioning by the congressmen and women is getting better over time is a good sign. The hearings that we had with Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook a year or so ago were appallingly poorly prepared by the congressmen and women. The antitrust hearings that we had more recently were much more well prepared. I think the next step, what we need is a national commission on technology and democracy that brings together technologists, journalists, activists, scientists, policymakers, and the platform leaders in a national commission that addresses these absolutely crucial questions that we have today.
I've seen a lot of headlines that talk about how Facebook, social media in general, is so closely associated with depression, with teen suicide and self-harm, with all these negative mood and affect results. But I also remember a piece of research that I saw, it appeared to be pretty well done, that tried to look systematically and came to the conclusion that the negative mood effects of social media were real, but they were very, very small. And the authors said they appeared to be small on the order of eating potatoes. Now, as an ethnic Irish person, I took this a little bit personally. So I'm really eager to get your take on what we know about how interacting with these platforms affects our moods, affects our outlook on life.
This is covered extensively in the book. There's a whole chapter on the neuroscience as I described. I have a 7-year-old son. I am incredibly concerned and paying attention to the role of these digital technologies, and in particular social media, which is so much about social affirmation, about how you feel about yourself, about FOMO, etc. What that does to our psychology, and I detail a lot of those studies that you're talking about in the book. In particular, for instance, one thing that scared me really a lot was that the neuroscience shows in neuroscience studies that when we receive randomly assigned likes on pictures that depict risky behaviors, it turns down the parts of our brains that would inhibit us from those behaviors. So in images or videos of drug use or alcohol that get more randomly assigned likes, the fMRI brain scans of people seeing the ones with either a lot of likes or a little likes The ones with that see a lot of likes randomly assigned, their inhibition centers of the brain are turned down. So, or maybe even turned off, which means that they're more likely to take these risky behaviors. I also assess all the evidence around loneliness, which is so important in terms of both the good and the bad, the promise and the peril of the hype machine. Part of it is, does it make us more lonely to be connecting, but just online, but not in person? Or does having those connections, especially at a time during a pandemic when we're forced to be online and not in person, actually give us a lifeline to human connectivity and what we need? The evidence shows that loneliness is like hunger or thirst. It actually creates a neural pain in our brains that force us to be social. And that's because being social is an essential survival technique of our species, just like being fed or drinking water is. And so all of that is covered in the chapter about social media as well. I mean, about the neuroscience of social media as well.
I'm positive you talk about this as well, but give us a little preview. Meeting somebody online, I believe, is now the single most popular way by which both gay and straight couples are formed, at least in America. This is a massive change in a really short space of time. Should we be worried about this? Is this okay? How do we think about it?
Well, let me put it to you this way. I was shocked when I read this and when I did the research for the book. The relationships that are formed and introduced by algorithms on the hype machine surpass the relationships that are formed by friends and family introductions in 2013. So 7 years ago.
In quantity, not quality.
In quantity, not quality. So more relationships are created now by the hype machine's algorithms than are created by our traditional means of meeting. And that's been true for the last 7 years, and it's becoming more true. Great. And so then you start to ask, well, how do those algorithms work? You don't get to browse on most dating apps. Some you do, but most you don't, different people that you might want to date. What you get is a series of yes-no decisions on people that are completely controlled by the algorithms, which gets to the very burning question, which is one of the driving questions of the book. How do those algorithms work? What are their objective functions? What are they maximizing? And if we believe that, and now we know in data, that the algorithms are driving the relationships and the relationships drive mating, then that's driving the genetic diversity of our human gene pool. It's driving evolution because that's who we're meeting to form relationships with. And so the answers to these questions are evolutionarily essential, not just people. When I first started studying social media, which was in the year 2000, okay, people came up to me and said, why would you want to study, pictures of blueberry muffins that look like chihuahuas on Facebook? And I said, it's much, much, much more important than that. And now society is seeing how important it really is.
I asked you a clarifying question a second ago about the quantity of relationships. What do we know about the quality of romantic relationships that are formed online?
I think the jury is still out on that question. So the long-term longitudinal studies of who stays together and what kind of healthy or unhealthy relationships are formed based on algorithms versus based on other types of meeting are still being done. But I'll give you an example of a study covered in the book done by my colleagues Jui Ramaprasad and Ravi Bapna, Ahmed Yermayurov, and Galit Shumeli, about how it's different to date online. So what they did was they did this great study which allowed people to browse anonymously. And what that did was the browsing aspect of dating on the apps where you can browse leaves digital breadcrumbs for those people you browse, saying, hey, Sinan was interested in you. He looked at your profile. They can follow back up with you and so on. When you are gifted anonymous browsing randomly, the people who get to browse anonymously are browsing much more diversely than they would have.
Oh,
Browsing interracial
really?
profiles, browsing homosexual as well as heterosexual profiles, browsing much more broadly than they would if they were not browsing anonymously. But the elimination of the digital breadcrumbs that they leave when they are browsing non-anonymously actually harms matching for women, because women are typically not, quote, making the first move on these dating apps. They are waiting for men to make the first moves. And when they don't leave the digital breadcrumbs as they browse, they get statistically significantly fewer matches.
Wow.
What does all this mean? What does all this mean? What this means is that the detailed technology decisions that go into how these things are designed, how the algorithms are designed, the simple question about whether you leave digital breadcrumbs as you browse or not can have a massive statistically significant impact on your match rates, on how you browse and what that means for the relationships you get into, and then what that means for evolution. The jury's still out on the long-term question.
You brought up that at least some of the congressional hearings did not leave our elected representatives covered in glory with the thoroughness of their knowledge or their preparation. Given that, how can we trust our lawmakers to make smart decisions in this important area?
Well, listen, I'm going to maintain some semblance of neutrality when I say that some of the congressmen and women were incredibly well prepared and asked great questions. And some of them really just kind of threw their 5 minutes away and were just great opportunities for the platform leaders to just dodge, duck, and parry.
Just run out the clock?
Yeah, run out the clock. And so the answer to your question is that we need to bring experts into this conversation at every turn. The congressmen and women need to consult the experts that have spent decades researching this stuff when preparing their questions and being coached on how to steer their 5-minute conversations towards real, meaningful answers. As well, as I described earlier, we need a national commission that brings scientific expertise into the discussion, and really just over and over again, bring the experts from all domains, from all fields into it, rather than just thinking that this isn't that complex and I can just sort of like wing it in the congressional testimony.
So you've advocated for a commission. Would you take that one decent-sized step farther and advocate for an algorithm oversight board at the federal level that would have some sway over these incredibly powerful algorithms that influence our lives?
That sounds quite authoritarian to me. So I don't think I would go that far. But I do think, and I do describe in Chapter 12, very specific sets of regulations that I think might make sense, which are about very specific things that are or are not done by the platforms in terms of the way they design their algorithms and so on. But the precursor question to what laws should we pass and what regulations should be doing is who should be passing those laws, who should be regulating. And what we see now is we see executive orders that would put the regulatory decisions in the hands of 5-person politically appointed commissions like the FTC and the FCC. I think that's the exact wrong way to go about regulating social media. I think what we would prefer to do when thinking about really broad and societally important questions like where to draw the line between free speech and harmful speech, where does the First Amendment contravene the 14th Amendment, is in deliberative representative bodies like the legislature, where we have passed things like the Stop Sex Trafficking Act, which was passed almost unanimously by the Congress, essentially outlawing advertisement of sex trafficking on social media platforms, and or the courts, like the Supreme Court, the case law evolving around where the limits of speech should be and where they shouldn't be, rather than, for instance, a 5-person politically appointed commission deciding when Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which provides a shield from civil liability to the platforms about their user-generated content, does or doesn't apply. I think that's the exact wrong way to regulate social media.
We've only got a few minutes left. I want to wrap up with asking you some author questions because you've just gone through the process of writing your first book and all the peaks and the valleys associated with that. One of my all-time favorite author questions is, what did you learn when you were researching and writing the book that surprised you the most?
Well, I think that in this case, two things. One is that this is a complex set of topics, and I have been researching this question, this topic for 20 years, but I was nowhere near well-informed enough across the broad range of important areas of research in order to write the book. And so I had to delve deeply, for instance, into the neuroscience of it all. I'm not a neuroscientist. I have a lot more background in the econometrics and the economics of it, so that was a little bit easier because I had read a lot of the research there. So I did expand and deepen my understanding of the topics in order to write the book, which taught me a lot that I lose when I'm so narrowly focused on my economics or data science or information science driven investigation of social media that I had before. I went deeply into cognitive science, social psychology, and so on. But the other thing that really surprised me the most was how difficult it is to write a book on such a complex topic for an audience in a way that is meaningfully communicative. And I tried really hard to do that. And if that forces you to use muscles that you've never used before, I am sore. Let's just put it that way. I worked really hard to distill this to not lose the complexity, but to also distill it in a way that was consumable by a broad audience.
And as someone who's read an advanced copy of the book, I can tell you and tell our audience how well you succeeded at that. The Hype Machine is a page turner, but like you said, it flexes, it makes you build up entirely new muscles as somebody who thinks for a living.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is such an important conversation going forward. I essentially, by writing this book, I wanted to really stir up, advance, nudge this conversation in a lot of ways, but I so look forward to participating in this conversation with all of you going forward, but with all the dedicated technologists and ethicists and policymakers that are trying to figure out and trying to make meaningful change on this topic going forward. It is an incredibly important set of decisions that we're going to have to make. We're at a crossroads, as I said. This conversation is really, really an important one, central to society today.
As somebody who studies all these fantastic new social media platforms, why did you pick such an old media way to get your ideas across? You wrote a several hundred-page book and it's being packaged in dead trees in large part. Why didn't you spin up a YouTube channel or stick with spinning up a YouTube channel, a really popular Instagram account, and be new school about this?
Well, there's two answers to your question. First is that I've been doing the other things as much as I possibly can prior to the writing of this book. I do have a TED Talk on misinformation, which actually hit 2 million views a couple of weeks ago. It's only been on the TED website since the turn of the year. So that's getting traction. I did create a website, sinanaral.io, which tries to collect a lot of this stuff. People who know me for a long time know that I've been a professor since 2000, for 13 years now, and I had this crummy website, and so they're saying to me now, well, you actually have a nice website. So I did some of that stuff as well. But the reason I wrote the book is that this is not just the purview of the technological elite. This conversation needs to be had in a broad public square. And there are a lot of people, very smart people, who are very important to what happens next, that read books and that where books are a communication starter. And that's why I chose to also engage in the dead tree form of communication.
Last question we have time for. Okay, now that this is off your plate, what do you want to work on next?
So as you well know, when the coronavirus hit at the IDE, we really steered our ship on a dime and headed straight for the pandemic. We spun up 4 massive projects in the social analytics lab and at the IDE. The first one was in collaboration with Facebook's Data for Good and SafeGraph and census data, looking at the impact of COVID policies on the trajectory of human mobility and the pandemic. We published our first paper, very large-scale paper on that subject in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences last month. We just released a follow-up study looking at the impact of reopenings last week on that. We also run the largest global survey on behaviors, perceptions, and norms around the coronavirus pandemic in collaboration with Facebook and the World Health Organization and Johns Hopkins. That is centered at the IDE. That looks at people's confidence in the vaccine, what's going to move people's confidence in the vaccine, whether they are going to go to restaurants or go back to work, whether those restaurant or employer policies on mask wearing and social distancing affect their likelihood of going to businesses or going back to work. So the big part of stemming the pandemic will be our behaviors and perceptions and norms. So we're surveying that at a global scale. Dean Eccles has been instrumental in leading that effort for us. We're also working with the Prakelt Foundation, who now runs the global WhatsApp channel for the WHO, rooting out misinformation, as well as Graphica Inc., studying misinformation in the election and the coronavirus. So I would say that right now, we're focused on real world impact on issues that matter, like the coronavirus and like election security. As well, I hope that this conversation about the hype machine will take center stage starting tomorrow when it releases.
Fantastic. We have put signed copies of the book in the mail to some of our stakeholders at the IDE. You can learn more about the work of Sinan and his colleagues at ide.mit.edu. Sinan just mentioned his website, sinanaral.io, has a new look and feel to it, and I can vouch that it's fantastic. Sinan, any final thoughts for our participants?
I just really appreciate being able to speak to this audience. There are so many smart people listening, and I'm so glad, and I wish I could see all your faces face to face. I'm so glad that you're here. Please participate in this conversation. We need all hands on deck, and we at the IDEA are doing our part. We're really glad to be on that journey with you.
Sinan, thanks for your time. Thanks for your work. Thanks for the fantastic book. Everyone, please enjoy reading The Hype Machine. Thanks for joining us.